This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Brad Lyon is a communications and knowledge management specialist. Currently, he is the Community Development Lead and Knowledge Manager at the Rocky Mountain Institute Carbon War Room, where he is contributing to the launch of an online community of practice that targets renewable energy practitioners in the Caribbean and other island states. Brad is also a consultant at the World Bank, where, over the last 6 years, he's worked in different capacities and contracts with the Latin American and Caribbean Urban and Disaster Risk Management Unit. His main contributions at the World Bank have related to building a knowledge management strategy to influence and encourage knowledge exchange across climate and disaster resilience investments in the Caribbean. Prior to the bank, Brad worked in a hospitality-focused startup company as a business developer and relationship manager, where he created the company's first environmental and social responsibility campaign and built marketing campaigns to target new clients and increase revenue. I spoke with Brad in Washington, D.C. Hi, Brad. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thank you, Stephen. Glad to be here.
Easy question to start. Where are you sitting at today? I know you fly all over the place. Where are you sitting?
Good question. I'm actually sitting here at DC. I've started a home-based office doing a bit of consulting right now for the past year and a half.
Yeah. You are like so many of us in this business. You have your fingers in a lot of different pies at the same time. Why don't you start by telling us what it is that you're working on right now?
Yeah, I've been consulting for the World Bank for about six and a half years. Right now, I'm just doing some consulting services with this risk insurance facility that's working in the Caribbean and Central America, trying to de-risk catastrophes related to excess rainfall, hurricanes, and earthquakes. And then for the past year, I started working with a nonprofit called the Carbon War Room, very interesting Richard Branson startup, and is now rather than working specifically on aviation sector, they've started a development project in the Caribbean, which again focuses on renewable energy transition. So I'm working on building a community of practice, trying to bring about 15 countries together and some other experts to really learn how to share knowledge and best practices. So that's over the time, that's really I've learned to focus my expertise and is on this communications and knowledge management side, as they call it.
And both of the things that you just described sound like they have an environment/climate characterization to them. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's been funny being at the World Bank, sitting there, and how the whole organization has restructured itself, and some of the nomenclature that comes around. And starting off in 2010, there was disaster risk management, which is kind of a new development field in itself. A lot of what we talked about was disaster management and just responding to things and reacting. And now over about 20, 30 years, changing that conversation of where the development aid is going to prevention. And this is really where disaster risk management has created its niche. But if you look at those two sides, a lot of the money is going still into the reaction of it rather than the prevention. However, what's happening due to a lot of the COP21, the climate finance, and all of this, that same term of disaster resilience is now called climate resilience. So how you sell and get money and really talk to donors to how you talk to clients has changed really quickly in those past 5 years. So to answer your question, yeah, because of the fact that these are quote unquote natural disasters, there are many of them, and you have to really speak to that from with a climate lens.
One of the things I love to do, and you're familiar with this, is to, you're like so many of us in this business, in that when we try to talk to someone about what it is that we do, we often get like blank stares or people ask, are you working for the CIA or something like that? So when you say something like de-risk catastrophes, what does that actually end up looking like on a day-to-day basis? What does that look like in real life?
On my personal day-to-day or for...
Yeah, I mean, for your personal day-to-day, what does this look like for you? Are you writing reports, or are you giving presentations? Are you building dikes for someone? What does it look like for you?
It's a good question, and maybe this is where I've kind of driven myself into this communications field, because a lot of what happens in these technical de-risking, financial risk or whatnot. Speaking of, how do you actually communicate that to people on the ground? And a lot of what the World Bank, for example, selling its services essentially, you need to be able to say why, in fact, they are a good partner to work with. And that's really communicating, first of all, what is the problem and then identifying that. And in many ways, they may not know what that is. I mean, there's a lot of problems I don't know until I have a conversation with someone and they can really help to figure that out. So I think when you start looking at the fact of huge amounts of rain coming through every year, I mean, you live in Central America right now, and you may note that there's a little bit of rain, but that rain over time, even if it's small, can accumulate. And that damages, although they're isolated and small over the course of a year, can equate to the same amount as a hurricane that comes through. So it's really looking at seeing the aggregate amount of data that comes through and then communicating that into a message. And so that's really where I've kind of helped to try to bring that technical language into a way that can be understood by other different audiences.
And so then what are you creating? Websites, social media output, reports, TV ads, radio ads? What's the output look like?
Yeah, I mean, it could be facilitating a workshop that comes around to bring different people around together to talk about the issues, look at things, potential solutions. It's also coming up with communication pieces that could be a video, a brochure, social media, perhaps. Really a lot of that, specifically in the World Bank, is a lot of this kind of donor-facing communications. So they have very routine meetings that happen and really trying to package those up into key messages that are really focusing on what the impacts of development dollars.
And so what you're characterizing is a potentially technical and highly complex conversation. And what I know, at least, the sort of the political environment in the United States, maybe in Europe as well, that there isn't really the leisure or the environment to be able to have that kind of complex conversation. So do you find that your work gets boiled down into sound bites? Is that another name for key messages or what?
I don't think it is. I think the conversation is really ongoing. And I think, especially, again, coming from that disaster risk management, I think there's a really good conversation happening specifically with donors. And I'm really happy to have been part of that conversation to bring light to this prevention side. And I think that's where we start thinking about every decision of what we do when it comes to where I'm going to build my house. Do I want to put it next to this river or do I want to put it on this hill? I mean, simple questions like that. Over time, you don't have the leisure of being able to make that decisions. You may not have the money to even make that decision. And a lot of these developing countries, and especially in these urbanized cities, they're just moving into places that are essentially accumulating risk. And so I think that that conversation is never dulling. It's only becoming more and more apparent, and the fact of it, I think it's in 2030. You can do some fact checking after 2030 and 2050. It's like 70% of the world's population is going to be in urbanized cities, and think about those mostly being near the water. So what does that do when you start considering about sea level rise and you talk about different, seismic activity that's concentrated in a lot of capital cities? So all of these things were never going to go away. They're only becoming much more apparent of how much attention needs to be focused on that. So, I mean, that's the conversation, but, it does get difficult to talk about that, especially in the States, because people don't want to either accept climate change or they don't necessarily feel like it impacts them in ways. And that's really due to the political arena that we live in here. But when you speak to the rest of the world, especially donors and even other clients, countries in the Caribbean or, for example, Central America, this really is the conversation. They know how the weather can impact and how it's increasingly getting more erratic. So there's a hunger for that conversation and there's a hunger for knowledge. And I think that's what I think is important about thinking, how do you really transfer that knowledge? How do you get people to engage in that conversation? So it's not a matter of sound bites. It's like, what's that hook? And how do you have a meaningful conversation? And that's where I think, making these connections creating an environment where people can have that conversation is really important. Again, that's where it gets into these Caribbean. You think about this renewable energy in the Caribbean. These countries or islands are 90,000 people, 100,000 people, and a bit isolated for obvious reasons. But there's a hunger to talk about how do I transition my economy into renewable energy. So again, there is this constant desire to connect and communicate. We're humans, right? So how do you just facilitate that relationship and then the communication? And
is there a moment that you can think of when you're giving one of these presentations or at a conference or something where it just is a total home run and everybody got it and there's going to be actionable items that come out of it? Or is it it's always kind of seen the slow grind of bureaucracy, the slow machinery of these large organizations?
So much of it is so hard to know, especially working in DC sometimes, living in an office. You don't necessarily get down to the field to see how the project's being implemented, especially when you're talking about large infrastructure projects. However, going down, we had an environmental and social impact assessment training, which brought together, again, like 8 or 9 countries. Again, it's just really a matter of getting the right people, the right room at the right time. You all of a sudden sit back and you see this great conversation and people sharing how they've been doing environmental impact assessments in St. Lucia, for example, versus Jamaica. And this kind of just all of a sudden just breathing this space creates, and there's this fire about people really wanting to learn from each other. And this is when you step back and say, what, we don't need to be here. We just need to let them work together. And so that's really where I feel like that convening is so important to bring. That was great to see that fire. People get really excited about environmental impact assessments, because this is really what's saving lives at the end of the day is how, and social impacts, right? How we can actually not just build a bridge, but actually think about how that's going to be holistically considered within that community or the areas around that being jungle or whatnot.
So now take us to the carbon war room. Everything that we know about Richard Branson is essentially the opposite of the World Bank, right? I mean, so how does that work juxtaposed against your work at the World Bank? What are the differences? What does it look like?
It's funny. I was actually in Rio Plus 20 back in 2010, I believe, and there was a islands meeting of which Richard Branson was sitting on the panel, and there was another woman, I believe, from the UN. But he was basically put on the spot in this panel. He had said, you know what? Yes, I want to help islands to transition. And he's like, I'll commit to one island. And the woman sat next to him. She goes, why just one? Why not 10? And so he'd been put on the spot. And I was there in this room when it was happening. So basically, to commit to give support, either, I guess, technical and financial support to help an island transition to 100% renewables. And I think at that time he had been working on reducing carbon emissions in the aviation sector and the other transportation sectors. But this is a really different commitment, right? This is a political commitment with a sovereign country or island, right? So I was sitting there, and then later on, about just a year ago, I ended up becoming invited. Actually, one of my old a Peace Corps friend and also one of my peers at the World Bank brought me into this project, which has now grown into the Islands Energy Program in the Caribbean. And they have also branched in with Clinton Foundation and the Rocky Mountain Institute. So it's this really strong partnership that's working there. Richard Branson just kind of seeds money and lets these things take off and really hopes the market really shows its favor to these initiatives. And that's the challenge, is this organization, the Carbon War Room particularly, they want to see the same acceleration and speed that you do with any sort of market initiative. But what we've had to do internally is communicate that this is actually a development project. You're working across many sectors. You're working with a lot of different interests, both from, say, the utility side versus the political side. There's that dance that happens, what you want to do politically and what is actually technically feasible, for example. So that's been interesting to see that internal conversation. and actually how this organization has evolved over time to focus on these islands.
So how do you divide your time between Carbon War Room and the World Bank and your personal stuff or whatever else other professional commitments you have? I mean, you're like a lawyer, you're building every 6 minutes or every 15 minutes. Do you build by the day? Are you keeping track of things really closely? Or how are you managing that aspect of your consulting life?
Yeah, it's been really hard, especially, past year and a half, just becoming, very independent. I've worked with a few coaches and really trying to build in certain skills, and that time management is like key, that taking that, 10, 15 minutes of planning every morning. It's been reminded to me that Ben Franklin used to do that, sit in his solitude with peace and just do that planning. And that's been really helpful and grounding over the past few months especially. But coming down to your question, yeah, I do a record every day of how much time I'm spending on this and that. And especially because you're always having to do business development for yourself, especially being independent, you need to be focusing part of that time on, updating your LinkedIn profile, reaching out to different people in your network, meeting this person and that. But, these contracts are usually based on days, right? So you have 50 days with this project, another 50 days with this project. I do keep a really kind of strict record of how many hours I spend each day. And then at the end of each month, I'll total those hours to how many days and then bill on that. So per project, per day, and then per month.
And so when you're planning your day, are you able to be very disciplined and break it up between your clients or between the tasks that you have for that day? Or do you find that you're kind of at the whim of your clients and, you're putting out fires, or they're calling up and saying, hey, I need you to do this today. How do you manage that?
Yeah, there really is that. There's a lot of that in the World Bank. There's lots of demands that come out you have to just quickly respond to. Less and less I've had to do that. But I have, still working with a team. So even if you are somewhat isolated working on your day-to-day schedule, there really is a need to create a, timeline or project, plan of action and to put that together. So I started working with this tool called Asana, for example. This is with this team, ASANA, which also always means posture and yoga. And that's really helpful to really kind of think about the whole month and go through regularly with your team. What are those deliverables that you have to do? Make sure the timelines are appropriate and you're getting the right information that you need, because you can't work in isolation completely. So I think it's better about being proactive and make sure you're communicating. And a lot of that means, kind of upward managing.
So before I take us down another path in this conversation, a few seconds ago, you put it really great where you always have to keep feeding the fire, right? And so I'm wondering, in your life, as you're looking into the future, how much time do you spend making sure that next gig is going to happen, or that you're able to continue to grow as a consultant? Are you leaning on your network? Are you writing proposals? Are you out there searching, different types of sites, or, what do you do to continue to develop business for yourself and make sure that you're continuing to grow and thrive?
It's interesting. Maybe this isn't the direct answer to your question, but I also teach yoga on the side. And yesterday I spoke with this guy who worked in development for many years. And he was talking about Global Witness, which he says is a great organization, but doesn't pay much. And I've thought about that just quickly, like how we get compensated in not just monetary ways, but in the fact that we are, doing good, that we're part of challenging the status quo, part of challenging the way that business gets done, part of challenging corruption like that happens within every government. And I thought, less and less the money's important for obvious reasons, especially if you've got some student loans in your bag. It's a difficult question to answer. I'm in that process right now after taking some time off really this year, trying to set some new goals. And what I realized that I haven't done in some time, you quickly just go down a path and you get on this boat and you don't really know where it's going and you just kind of trust that it will land in a place. And I think it did bring me to some higher ground, but I'm really looking at taking that time to vision and see what's really core. What have I gained from that past 5 years? What are some strengths that I should focus on, and what particular sectors do I want to be working in? And I think, like we started at the beginning, all of these do kind of focus around this kind of climate adaptation, resilience, energy. So I think that's where I'm starting to focus my attention more. But I think taking that time, again, like I mentioned at the beginning of every day, taking that time every 3-6 months maybe and really set those long-term goals. Perhaps you could give me some guidance afterwards.
So you've actually kind of set the stage perfectly for the next question here. You said you've been looking back reflectively over the last 5 or 6 years, kind of looking at your career. How did you get into this business? Did you find yourself, when you were 14 or in high school and you say, oh, I know, I want to go work for the World Bank and travel to these exotic places? Or did you just kind of find yourself here one day? How did you get here?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't think I even knew the World Bank existed until I got there. I had after I graduated undergrad, I had the opportunity to either go to the Peace Corps or become a flight attendant. And the Peace Corps accepted me. So that became the boat I took.
The coin toss.
I studied business, and this whole thing about everything being driven by money, by profits, by revenue. And I just thought there's something wrong with this, when we're trying to serve people, but we're being driven by money. So I really took that boat of looking at the Peace Corps to reflect on a lot of things and for me, really get to the bottom of the barrel, like what's down there. And I know coming from New England, this is a very privileged part of the world. And what's happening on the other side. And got the opportunity to go to West Africa, to Guinea, Conakry. And over that time, I remember sitting there, there's one gas station where you can buy cold Coca-Cola. Everybody hangs out there. You see a lot of the international development workers coming through. And this, not many white people in this village. So I had somebody came up and started talking to me from the World Food Program. And they said, oh, we're just, this is what we're doing. We went up to this small village. I'm like, well, how is it? She's like, this is a place that is not just impoverished, but there's some real issues of hunger up here. And we need to bring some aid here. And I was like, of course. How do you guys not know this? What, you guys are just coming in here every 3 years? Or, there's striking things that you see when you're in the field and you're in these places and you have no way of communicating that. And when you do, the outlets you do have are not necessarily going to get to the top. And then I started seeing some other organizations that are working in another area and the Peace Corps itself working kind of on its own channels. And how are we not convening and working together? And it really upset me, thinking that there's people somewhere around the world and no one's here on the ground to actually see how those could interface together and support each other. So that really took me back after 2 years thinking about what to do next, is going into grad school and try to understand what are those dilemmas? Why is that working? What is what are this donor competition about? Because this person's getting money and this person's getting money. So we have to prove this and that. And it's not in everybody's interest to be sharing and working together. So I think to answer your question, that's how it kind of got me interested in this field of doing good, right? Of humanitarian work, and knowing that for many people it is often a business. A lot of people live really well and operate for their own interests, and that's also something that is striking getting into this field. But for the most part, I've been really warmed by the altruism and the intention to collaborate and work together. But I know on the ground that's really hard to do. And I think that's where a lot of our work should be towards, is how do we really connect and work thoughtfully on these topics.
What's the biggest fail that you've seen over the last 10 years of your career? And what did you do or what was done in order to sort of bring that project back in line or do something about that fail?
The short answer is not following through. Throwing money problem, or let's, help, we'll intervene for these 3 months and then we'll walk away and give up. I don't know if I want to bring up any specific stories, but I think that's routine. There's an end of a project that's 5 years, and then you're done. Or end of a project that's a year, and then you kind of walk away, you do your bit of evaluation, but you send that forward. Who's going to pick that up, or who's going to really follow through? I'll give you an example from the Peace Corps, and I was very critical about this part, that you are in this kind of 2-year cycle, and someone else comes in right afterwards who wants to make their own relationships, have their own agenda, and they're told that they can do whatever they want. Just start connecting with the community and see what identifying those needs. But after 2 years, you really have an opportunity to do that, and there's no bridge to connect and build off each other. So I think that's what's really frustrating, and that happens in all the organizations that I've worked in. You don't really know what the impact is. You're just trying to get something done. And I think that could be flipped, or somehow thinking about what that impact and checking on that at the end. There's a lot of that doesn't happen. You only do it in the aftermath, or it's a third party that does it. So I don't think we really correct our systems as much or change as much as we need to.
Yeah, I'm trying to coin a phrase myself that we need to move away from evaluation and actually start performing. Like, stop evaluating, start performing. But that's another topic. So, flip side of the coin here, what are you most psyched about for the next sort of 5 years? You've built your career, you're 10 years in. What's the future look like for you? Is there a gig you're looking forward to? Is there a particular piece of technology you're excited to use? Is there a network you want to get connected with? What are you psyched about for the future?
Staying on this kind of climate, I have a lot of different interests, and I could go down few different answers with that question. I think that the climate financing, if you look at the Green Climate Fund, what the countries have really committed to, it's like $100 billion of climate financing per year. And you think about how much money that is, and that's really the private sector implementing all of those projects, right? But it's countries borrowing this money or being given this money to get these things done. And seeing how that money is going to be spent, and that's going to impact the next 20, 30 years, 50 years of the development of many of these countries. So I think that's really important for all of us to kind of tune in where this money is, what it's going to. And I think that interface, specifically when you're talking about public money to the private sector, that really interests me. Like where that happens, what kind of deals are brokered, are they clean, are they not? I think that would really intrigue me. I'm also thinking about climate change itself and how people talk about global warming daily and how we need to adapt to it. I'm also just wondering if somebody's just going to come up with this like super molecule that shoots up in the atmosphere and just like freezes the world by accident. So I'm kind of curious how that science is working at the same time as development money.
So a couple more questions for you. First is, why independent? You found yourself just a little bit a while ago, a year or so ago, you made the choice to sort of make the leap and do it on your own. You get your home office, you're kind of moving things forward rather than sort of moving down the institutional path. Why'd you make that choice, and how'd you make it happen?
Yeah, well, I think now I am looking forward to a little bit more institutional, more of a day-to-day routine with the same team or organization. But I really needed to step back. I think there was a lot of things that were going on, particularly with some restructuring of different organizations and merging, and that I just needed to get out and reflect a bit and work on what was really important to me, and figure out what that is as well. Yeah, I mean, I see that more and more, that people do take time off, whether that's a few months, a year, and really saying that's okay. And I think I keep hearing that from a lot of other people, we want to do work and do good and kind of feverishly getting these things done, but taking that time for yourself, every so often or at the end of the day is really critical, and not getting delusioned and really thinking about what the big picture is important. So
the last question I have for you is one that I ask every guest here on the Terms of Reference podcast, or at least I try to, is, you've been at it for a while, but there's a lot of people listening to this podcast who are either in a master's degree right now or a bachelor's degree, or they're kind of listening and they're interested in transitioning from another sector into the development sector, the humanitarian aid sector, what are your critical pieces of advice for creating a sustainable and successful career in this profession?
I think it's the development itself. It's hard to say I'm an international development practitioner, right? And I think even that you need to get down a little bit more granular. What is it that you do? Having those technical skills, let's say I'm a communications specialist, for example, or I do disaster risk assessments, or, I work in evaluation, project management, something of that nature that really holds you to give value to the organization or team that you'll be working in. So I think rather than seeing just international development, see yourself as something that you already are. So moving in from the private sector or from other previous experience, there's something there, probably one or two skills that are really core, and kind of redefine that in a different realm. And I think that's the thing, is like communicating marketing professional to communications or public affairs. These are all of the same skill set, right? But it's really just kind of applying it to that new world, if you will.
Thank you so much for your time today. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Stephen.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.